Hello and welcome to Seeing Jesus with Paul Miller. I'm Liz Voborel and I'm here with Paul and our colleague Robert Rowe, who heads up our student ministry. And we've been in this series on Jesus's passion, just looking at his life, the end of his life, and in particular how that just dials up the love that we see him showing, demonstrating. It just dials it up to see that against the background of all that he's enduring, how he continues to move forward in love. So, Paul, what do you want to put on our mind as we move into today's episode?
Well, we'll be discussing the cross today, and it's actually from our Person of Jesus study that we're working from. I just want to encourage you to, what a great time of year to be actually studying the Passion, but it's Unit 5 called the Passion. And let me just give some little context before we dive in specifically to the cross, and just to kind of review the overall picture. And these times are fairly rough, but it looks like around 12 midnight, Judas and the Roman guard arrives at Gethsemane to seize Jesus and the disciples. The disciples flee at Jesus' request, and they are taken first to Annas's house, who is kind of the godfather of the high priest. The Talmud talks about the bazaars of Annas, which were what Jesus cleaned out. And so this is a power. If Jesus cleaning out the temple was a power play, this is their response. They are now coming back, and then after Annas's house, it looks like they go to Caiaphas' house, where you have the Sanhedrin trial. Peter's denial is there, and we're probably about 3 a.m. This is a little odd tidbit. Because we know the cock crows, so we are early in the morning, and we just have this tidbit, and you don't know to what extent this is true or whatever. But Josephus, who's writing 40 years later, has this offhand comment that the cock crowed in Jerusalem about 3 a.m. And cocks, if you've been around chickens, they wake you up. So anyway.
You don't want the room next to the chicken house?
Yeah. So then there's a shift right after that to Pilate. So Pilate, and again, this is give or take 1 or 2 hours either way. So Pilate begins his interrogation of Jesus, let's say around 4 a.m. And we've discussed that. And during that time, there's an interlude where he's interrogated by Herod, which is probably at the other end of the palace. The Herodian palaces had like were sort of two palaces with a big pool and atrium in the center. It has never been unearthed in Jerusalem. We do know where it is, roughly in the southwest or Armenian quarter. And so then Pilate has the famous scene of washing his hands, and Jesus is taken probably around 6, 7 o'clock, even maybe 8 o'clock in the morning to be crucified. And just a comment or two on the cross itself. We've already had a mention of the cross by Jesus about a year before, when they were up at Caesarea Philippi, and where Jesus had said that he was going to be killed, that he was going to be crucified. And that's when Peter pushes back against Jesus and says, God forbid that this would happen. And Jesus says, unless you take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of me. And I just find that fascinating, because when Jesus does that, I'm going to use a business term. Jesus creates the cross into a brand at that point. It's just, and it has ever since been the chief brand of Christianity. It's just fascinating that he does that. That he so he has, no one believes at this point that Jesus is going to, I mean, it's horrific. They're just horrified at the thought. And Jesus at that point takes, I was talking about it with, Adam Barker, our head of Praying Life Ministry. We were just sort of reflecting on branding, and the danger of branding is that it becomes an idol. That you focus on the brand, on the name, and we were just both kind of reflecting on that and thinking of that Jesus actually creates a symbol that unifies his entire life, and it is around the cross. I mean, we are all here because of the resurrection. And I think our instincts would have been create a brand out of I don't know how you would do it, but kind of a moving stone around your chain. I don't know.
So Paul, how would the disciples have likely interpreted "take up your cross and follow me" if Jesus hadn't gone to the cross yet? Are they thinking, "Whoa, what do you mean, a Roman cross? Like, why would I do that?"
I mean, they're horrified. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't even think they heard Jesus. I mean, I just think they were so stuck on. I would have been that way. I'd have been so stuck on this, because it's so counter to everything. But it is. I don't know. What other thoughts do you have?
It's striking, like what you're saying there. It's also impossible for us to hear cross the way they would have heard it, because we do know the whole story, right? And so it's like we know it from the garment being inside out, right? Like a different whole way, like as a symbol of the resurrection, of victory. But the way they would have known it would have been so different from that. So it's interesting what you're saying there, and just the power of that, the symbol, even before Jesus was on a cross, what that would have meant.
Yeah, I think it just would have been so shocking. It's interesting because the same question came up this morning in a study I had with some guys. A guy asked that, like, what would they have thought of that? And I think it would have been such a shocking statement that Jesus was making, that they would, post-resurrection, they would fully understand now what he meant by it. But then really didn't really have a full understanding of what he was saying.
Yeah. And also makes me, I'm just at seeJesus remembering of a thing, John Horry. We were talking about John Horry, who's often on this podcast, and he's known as sort of like the unsalesperson at seeJesus. Like if someone really wants him to do something, he's like, do you really want that seminar? I don't know that you really like. I feel like Jesus is being very unsalesperson, like by being like, you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me. Like, okay, never mind. Like it's definitely.
And you could see the brand. You could see, I probably should have clarified, you could see the clarity of him branding, because he is not, when he says, take up your cross daily and follow me, he's not, it's a symbol, because he's not saying you go get crucified literally every day,
Right. Doesn't work either.
And Robert, you just said the disciples just being shocked by it. And I mean, the Romans were shocked by it. I mean, the Romans used this, the cross sort of for your special, nasty, particularly rebellious criminal. And even though it was their ultimate tool of power, they were themselves embarrassed by it. And the reason we can pick that up is because there are no Roman descriptions of crucifixion. I'm sorry, I corrected. We only have 4 depictions of crucifixion in the entire Roman era when crucifixion was being used, which was, they got it from the Persians. So there was about a 400-500 year period where they were using crucifixion. And those 4 descriptions are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's it. There's no, and there's actually quite a bit you learn about crucifixion. I mean, just where I'm not going to detail it all, but if you actually pull back, it's kind of surprising. They just sent 5 soldiers to do the crucifixion. They were actually pretty comfortable with their overall power. The fact that they didn't send 100, 50 for crowd control, and because it just mentions that there were 4. It was the smallest unit of the Roman army, was 4 soldiers with a centurion and officer there. Little things about there are. I think there is another reference to sign somewhere, but that they would put a sign over the crucified person. The fact that they would that they would take the person's garment and gamble over them, or divide them up. Sort of spoils of war. Just little things like that are in the fact that there was that they were in a public place. There was dialogue with the crowd and the crucified people, and just a lot of little things that you could probably make up a list of 20 things that we learned about how to do crucifixion. But the fact that we only know it from the Gospels shows their own horror at crucifixion. So anyway, they are led. So let's just trace through the cross now. And Liz, could you read Luke 23 there? We are taking pieces from all the different Gospels here.
Yes, this is Luke 23. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.'"
Yeah, thank you, Liz. So there's actually no reference to Jesus stumbling in the Gospels. And Luke gives us this tidbit. As a doctor, he's just often focused on physical details. But clearly the implication, the inference is the Romans on the way were making, as another little thing that we didn't know, that you had to carry your cross. And we don't know if that was the cross pole, the entire cross, or just the cross beam. So it's just a little detail that we don't know. Probably the cross beam is often the kind of the inference, because that way they wouldn't have to keep, they'd have the pole set up there, already, that they could do that. But anyway, they pull someone from the crowd, and the reason he's mentioned, and there's a great book, I think it's a British scholar, Gathercole, but that I'd have to double check that, called The Named People in the Gospels. And his inference, Gathercole's inference, is that when someone is named in the Gospels, were likely part of the Christian community. And so it's likely that Simon became a believer, which is, it'd be hard to not carry Jesus' cross and not become a Christian. And then there's, again, I should have done my homework better. There is a reference to Simon's sons, I think from Paul in Romans 16, who are now in Rome. So anyway, and Simon would have been an African from Cyrene, which was modern day Libya. So it's just kind of a neat detail. And then Jesus, you wonder if this even happened so he could talk to these women just in God's wisdom. So these women are weeping. And again, we have said earlier, the sense of Christians is that weeping was the dominant noise of the passion, but it's only here that we have a reference to that. We have all these references by implication to laughter, mocking, particularly in the book of Mark. But it's the mockings in all the Gospels. So laughter, remember, the crowds. There's a lot of laughter at the cross. With, of course, I'm sure. Well, we know the women were standing nearby, and there's no reference to them mourning there. I could well imagine they themselves were in shock. And so the women are weeping, and Jesus says, "Don't weep for me, but for yourselves and your children." And Jesus is looking 40 years ahead of time when he says the time will come when they will say, "Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." In other words, looking forward to the destruction of Jerusalem that is going to be horrific 40 years later. So, Liz and Robert, any thoughts?
Yeah, just the amazement of kind of what you've brought out before, Paul, of here he is in the midst of such suffering, and his focus is not on himself and the pain he's in, or the shock of being the Son of God nailed to about to be crucified, all the things that he could be turning inward on. He continues all the way to the cross to be outward.
Yeah.
All the way down to the thief who's hanging next to him.
And also, even to see those women and that they're weeping, because I think that is, it's kind of a part of what you're saying, Robert, right? But I think in our own, when we're in great pain or sorrow, often don't even notice the people around, or these are bystanders with Jesus. So it, I just feel like, often we don't even notice them, let alone converse or connect or see them in the way he does, where he's actually talking with them. So it's like that just underscores that not self-focused. He's not self-absorbed, even at this point, in what he's going through.
Yeah, to love in the midst of severe pain is just, it is godlike, And remember that this is the first thing that the centurion sees about Jesus. Remember, at the end of this, the centurion is going to come to the conclusion, without ever seeing a miracle, that this man was God. And so it's beginning to see, whoa, something's different about, I thought, it's just an example that came to my mind, Liz, of that is that maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I had a corneal issue, and I had to get my corneas sanded.
That sounds pleasant.
Ooh. This isn't a do-it-yourself kind of job, right, Paul? It's not go get yourself some sandpaper. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the cornea has 5 layers, and my outer layer, I had this thing called corneal dystrophy something. And the cure for it is you sand the cornea. And so I remember, I was down at Will's Eye Hospital, and he had warned me of this. He said he's had women who had given birth said this was worse. And that first day, I couldn't think. I just couldn't think. And so Jesus is having his corneas, and yet to love in the middle of great pain is just very difficult, and it's just this, and to see, as Jesus said, it's weak in my Reformed tradition, this idea that to see what Jesus says to Philip is to see me is to see the Father. Haven't you been with me this long? And Jesus had just said that. Yeah, I think that's John 14, where we are looking at what the Father is like. We are looking at what God is like. So he is not self-focused. We're looking at pure love. No turning inward. So it's just magnificent. A couple things on just crucifixion that you might be. There has been some study by doctors on this, and on the crucifixion, and the one well-known essay that Lee Strobel talks about, his case for Christ, talks about hypovolemic shock, which is that the severe loss of blood being worn out, and is that, and then suffocation is what Jesus is going through, because to breathe you have to push up against the nails that you're on the cross. We actually don't know if they nailed Jesus' hands. We actually don't quite know whether they nailed them through the palm of his hands or into his wrist. A lot of people have said it had to be at his wrist to hold his weight, but most of the weight would have been held by his feet. And we do have but it is interesting that the Shroud of Turin does show the nails through his wrist, which is interesting that they, if it was a forgery, it would have been unusual that they would have thought that through, because every single painting of Jesus in the Middle Ages and the late Roman era has the nails through his hand and not his wrist. The reason for his wrist, of course, is because it would a nail in a hand could rip through if there was any weight on it. But like in all history, there's a lot of things that are fuzzy. Because the only problem with the Shroud of Turin is that there have been several testing of the fabric and of carbon-14, which is pretty accurate, and that it was more. I think it showed it was from the 16 or 1700s. There's evidence pro and con. It's not something that we have any kind of definitive answer whether the Shroud of Turin is accurate or not. They did find in 1968 the bones of a crucified male and there have been several studies on the bones, and it looks like it is a single ankle bone. And with the nail in it, they had trouble getting the nail out of the cross. So they just cut off the cross itself. It was just too wedged in. So you could actually see that in Jerusalem. And it looks like the first time they thought they had one nail through two ankles, and now the more recent study was one nail through an ankle. By the way, it just shows you a lot of things in history and archaeology that are this old are open to a lot of different interpretations, which is I was a history major in college, and you just learn to nuance things. And since I'm a Presbyterian, that's the only thing we do is nuance things. You can get overly nuanced. But anyway, let's just reflect on the statements. Liz, do you want to read the first one from Luke 23?
Yeah. So we're going through now the last 7 statements of Jesus on the cross. And the first one is when Jesus loves the soldiers, saying, "Father, forgive them." The context there is Luke 23, 32 to 43. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the King of Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise."
There are so many things here. Father, forgive them. It's just interesting. This has just become I've said before in this podcast, Jesus is a peasant, and he has peasant styles of relating. Does not say that Jesus. Peasants are brilliant. I'm not, that's not a derogatory comment. But there's certain ways of talking that are sort of universal, these universal pithy statements, like that just are memorable. There's so many things that Jesus says that are so memorable because they're so pithy. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That just sort of implants itself. And he's holding back the wrath of God, and they don't realize that they're crucifying an innocent man. So Jesus is showing mercy on him. In the Old Testament, the wrath of God will break out. Kim and I are going through that cartoon Bible in the morning. Kim loves it. She loves the Israelites complaining, and the wrath of God keeps breaking out against the Israelites. And why wouldn't that? I mean, Jesus is protecting these men and loving them.
Yeah, the weight of those words, just people that heard them. It just struck me when you were saying that, Paul, thinking of Stephen echoing these same words in Acts, even before these words were recorded by John or by Luke. Likely, Stephen indicating the church is already quoting Jesus' words that he said on the cross before they're even written down.
Yeah,
likely, and that statement, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing."
Yeah, and the other thing is that, how did you die when you were being crucified or tortured to death? You cursed the people that were doing it. It was sort of your final act to pronounce judgment on them. People were scared of curses in the ancient world. They really believed in the power of blessing. And in our flat two-dimensional world, that doesn't even register with us. But probably the most famous one at this time was in Second Maccabees. These 7 brothers were being tortured to death for refusing to, I forget what it was, either bow before the idols that Antiochus Epiphanes had set up in the temple, or to eat pigs. I forget. And the little quote, "You cursed wretch," is what one of them is saying. And so it's for how people died, it was a whole new way of dying. Probably the only person in the ancient world who hadn't died that way was Socrates. He's sort of famous for his good death, receiving it so placidly.
When, Paul, you mean like kind of being when you're being murdered, or you don't mean killed. Like dying of some sort of natural cause. You mean
right. Sorry,
if you're being killed, right?
Yeah, if you're being killed, right. It was kind of the only way.
Go out kicking and screaming is sort of
the. So Jesus is setting everywhere he goes, he's setting a new gold standard, and it's just. That will be. It's been with the church for 2,000 years. A famous a well-known politician in our day, just quoted Jesus. It was just hilarious, but I won't say who it was. I'm trying to be non-political here, but it's just
still quoted today.
Yeah, it's just quoted. Today. It was just last week, and it's well known. I mean, I think. I'd be interested to see how many Americans know who said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Who the original speaker is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would bet I bet it's up to 70, 80% of adults. It's just such a, it's going down because, biblical illiteracy is on the rise, but it's just, anyway, it's just, lovely.
Yeah.
One other thing is Jesus' clothing. It must have been a beautiful garment because it was seamless. You had to have, the reason you would patch together garments is because you for a robe is because it was really expensive to have that wide of a loom.
Mm-hmm. So
this is probably a ridiculous expensive garment that Jesus has. And my conjecture is that it came from the wealthy women that supported him. That it's just neat that Jesus is dressed beautifully. It's just, John the Baptist, had camel's hair.
Maybe did not so much.
Yeah. So it's just like, people can get weird with money either way. They can get, we probably have more trouble showing it off. But in a world, in pre-industrial world, clothing was a huge marker of your status because it was so wicked expensive. It's just kind of neat to see that. And of course, the sign on the cross is, as we've said before, we've thought of Jesus as, this is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. By the way, remember when Pilate said, "Where are you from?" He was not asking his name. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And he's clearly asking, he knew that. He knew where Jesus was. Where are you from is not what's your hometown, but are you actually God? And of course, Pilate, the main thing Pilate is mocking here is not Jesus, but the Jews, and they know it. And, it's a kind of a double mock. And the other one, let me just point out here, is Satan is back Satan is here at the cross, tempting Jesus to act on his own will, to use this is why the will is so, Jesus is submitting to his heavenly Father. So he is standing down from from making bread. So it's the same temptation as making bread, is he's not going to use his divine power to protect himself from suffering. And they are tempting him to do that. He saved others. Let him save himself if he is Christ of God. In other words, prove that you're the Christ of God, not by jumping off the cross. And he is just silent. And it's just, and then the mocking comes from passerbyers, and you can see it being kind of contagious. It looks like it starts with the high priests and their hooligans mocking Jesus, and then the passerbyers pick it up, and then the thieves pick it up. And it's just striking. The only person that defends Jesus in the entire passion, openly defends Jesus, is a thief. It's just the beauty of the kingdom. And Luke picks that up because Luke has such an eye for this. So that's our Jesus.
All right. Well, I think we'll pause there and pick up. We have 6 more statements to come from Jesus at the cross, and we'll be heading to those in our next episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you are looking for something to do to engage, just watch Jesus during this season. We'll be again offering our free Lent study during the lunch hour on Thursday afternoons. At least that's the lunch hour in generally in America. We aim to, it usually lines up with the East Coast, 12 to 1. So if you have flexibility on Thursdays at that time, we'd love for you to join us. You can find that at seeJesus.net under our upcoming events. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening.